Hello there. This is the third of 5 videos I'm going to be making reviewing the 2025 Chardonnays from one of New Zealand's best Chardonnay producers, Kumeu River. So the wine I'm looking at today, 2025 vintage of the Coddington Vineyard Chardonnay. The 2025 vintage has just been released by the winery, so I was very excited to try these wines. Now, Kumeu River are best known for their Chardonnays, and those are predominantly grown in and around Kumeu, somewhere about sort of 17 kilometres outside the centre of Auckland. As well as the Kumeu River wines, they also have an entry-level or affordable range of wines that they call Kumeu Village. The Brajkovich family also make a small range of high-quality bottle-fermented sparkling wines. And outside of the West Auckland region, they also have a vineyard at Rays Road in Hawke's Bay, further down the east coast of New Zealand's North Island. But the wines in the Kumeu River range include a Pinot Gris. They have an estate Chardonnay I reviewed in my last tasting. There will be a link below that you can follow and watch that if you want to. But then they also make 3 single vineyard expressions of Chardonnay. This wine, Coddington, and then they have 2 other vineyards, Hunting Hill and Matty's Vineyard. The Brajkovich family own both Hunting Hill and Matty's Vineyard, and in fact they're just across the state highway from the winery, whereas Coddington sits about sort of 6 or 7 kilometres further north, just outside a place called WINEMAKING. And this is a vineyard that's leased by the Brajkovich family. Now, the Coddington Vineyard takes its name from the fact that it was originally owned by Tim and Angela Coddington. And Tim Coddington is well known as a film producer. Evidently, he has producing credits for Crazy Rich Asians, Bridget Terabithia, Mulan, and Full Metal Jacket, just to name the films that I've heard of. This vineyard was first planted in 1994, and from 1998, the fruit started going into Kumeu River's estate Chardonnay. Now, the vineyard produces a particularly rich and ripe style of Chardonnay, and so in 2006, they made the decision to bottle this as a single vineyard wine, and it's been made as such for the last 20 years. Now, Tim and Angela Coddington sold the vineyard in 2015, but the new owners have continued to lease it to the Brajkovich family, and the Brajkoviches now have full control over every aspect of vineyard management. And in fact, they're really quite pleased because they've managed to negotiate a longer lease. They had been renegotiating on a yearly basis. The site is gently north-facing, has quite rich, heavy clay soils, and there's a couple of the features that differentiate Coddington from the Brajkovich's own vineyards, Hunting Hill and Matty's Vineyard, is the fact that this is planted entirely with a clone called Clone 5, which tends to give quite a tropical fruit nature to the wines that it produces. Clone 5 is also known as the Gingin clone, and the vines here are now 32 years old. The other difference for Coddington in terms of management compared to Kumeu River's other single vineyard wines is the fact that this is the only vineyard that's planted with a single vertical hedge, what they call vertical shoot positioning, as opposed to the lyre trellising that the Brajkoviches use on their own vineyards in Kumeu. Over the years, evidently, leaf roll virus and trunk disease has killed quite a number of vines within the Coddington vineyard, and the answer has actually been to extend the arms of remaining vines to cover the gaps in the trellis that have been left by vines that have died. And actually, there is a suggestion that this helps to give a larger area of canopy, which may benefit the quality of the fruit here. Now, 2025 is remarked upon as having been quite an exceptionally dry vintage, dry particularly at harvest. Kumeu River started harvesting the grapes for their sparkling wines on the 4th of February. A week after that, there was 17 millimetres of rain, and then following that, it remained dry until the end of the harvest on the 17th of March. The growing season overall was excellent. It was mostly dry, and there were warm conditions, but there weren't particular temperature spikes. In fact, there were only 2 days throughout the season where the temperature exceeded 28 degrees Celsius. One of those was in December and the other in February. And this steady warmth with no extremes was ideal for the development of aromas in the fruit. And the dry conditions and relatively moderate yields have contributed to quite a rich structure in the wines from 2025. The Brajkovich family tell me this has been an outstanding vintage for their wines. And following 2 consecutive small harvests in 2023 and 2024, both of which seemed to hit Coddington more than any of their other vineyards, it's quite nice to know that production was back to what they referred to as normal levels. And they made somewhere just short of 1,000 cases of Coddington Chardonnay in 2025. The approach to winemaking, everything here is hand harvested and is whole bunch pressed, and they believe in fermenting with a high degree of solids, so there's no settling and racking to allow clear juice to be fermented, instead of which the cloudy juice is run into barrel and each individual fermentation is allowed to start of its own accord with the indigenous yeasts that have come into the winery from the vineyards. So everything is barrel fermented. The barrels used are 228 litre Burgundian-style barrels. In fact, a wonderful detail here. Evidently for Coddington, the Brajkovich family favoured the use of Claude Gillet barrels. He's a tonnelier from southern Burgundy. Evidently the style of oak that he produces suits the fruit from this vineyard the best. Now, 25% of those barrels are new every year. The wine undergoes a full malolactic conversion and stays in barrel with quite high solids, which are stirred occasionally to keep them in suspension, for about 11 months, right the way through until the wine was bottled in May 2026. So let's take a look at the wine, shall we? There's a nice depth of yellow colour there. There's a medium intensity, perhaps a hint of green, but as I say, a nice intensity. The wine has 14% alcohol and is fairly readily clinging to the sides of the glass there. It doesn't take long to produce some quite thick tears that are running down the side of the glass. I'm already smelling some lovely creamy notes, a hint of butterscotch, suggesting lees aging and malolactic, and there's some peachy notes. But let's have a closer look at the aromas, shall we? There's a richness and a purity. There are those creamy notes and quite a ripe, tropical, peachy fruit. At the same time, there's a refinement and an underlying hint of minerality there. Just perhaps a flintiness at the very end of the aromas. So it's for taste. There's good fresh acidity, and there's a really nice smooth texture. There are cedary notes, vanilla. People sometimes describe Merceau as being mealy, and that's what this is showing at the moment. Those slightly drying, slightly dusty sort of mealy notes. And behind that, there is that quite ripe, slightly tropical note of ripe peach with an underlying note a bit like pineapple that's practically ushered through there by the acidity. There are some hints of salinity on the finish, but as far as the Coddington's concerned, it's really a juicy, tropical edge, peachy fruit that's enduring throughout the wine. Of the wines of Kumeu River, I would normally say the Coddington is probably the most approachable of the single vineyard wines when young. Certainly that appears to be the case here. Although actually, if you compare it back to the 2024, which was a very ripe vintage, this is actually a little more refined. I think when I was talking about the wine, it was the creaminess and the notes of oak that came through first before the fruit. So I think actually this is a wine that would probably benefit from at least 2 or 3 years in the cellar. Talking to Paul and Michael Brajkoviches yesterday, they were suggesting that these wines show best at between 4 and 8 years of age. Certainly the concentration of fruit and the excellent acidity here support that. And the other thing that's really impressive is just quite how long those flavours are remaining on my tongue. I tried to see if there was an aggregated critic score on Wine Searcher. As of yet, they have no reviews there. Personally, I'd give this a score of 94 out of 100, and I wonder if I'm being a little mean there, but I do think the wine will need that time to open up. Perhaps it's not quite as immediate as the previous vintage. I think this is a really good example of this wine and may well develop further as it ages. So I will be very interested to see how the wine develops. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, I'd be really grateful if you could press the like button. If you're enjoying watching these videos, do please consider subscribing. Do also set yourself an alert. That way you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting. I still have 2 more of these Kumeu River wines to look at, the Hunting Hill and the Matty's Vineyard, so do please join me for those. If you have any comments or questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at or the tastings I'm doing. I will, of course, leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see where it's available and at what price. And hopefully this year Coddington should be much easier to find than it has been for the last couple of vintages. So thank you once again for taking the time to join me. I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time in the near future and come and watch some old tastings. Thank you so much. Bye for now.